August 1, 1944, Loire Valley, France. The morning air hangs thick with the smell of scorched earth and diesel fumes. A German panzer engineer named Klaus Hartmann crouches in the shadow of a disabled Panther tank, its treads torn and useless, watching through binoculars as dust clouds rise on the southern horizon. He has been trained at the finest technical academies in the Reich, schooled in the mathematics of warfare, in the precise calculations of fuel consumption, maintenance cycles, and the immutable laws of mechanical warfare. He absolutely knows, that what he is seeing is impossible. The American columns should be 2 days behind their current position, maybe 3. They should be stalled at the Seine, entangled in their own supply lines, vulnerable and slow. Yet there they are, a river of olive green steel flowing across the French countryside, like water breaking through a dam, moving at a pace that defies everything he has learned about armored warfare. Hartmann lowers his binoculars and feels something unfamiliar twist in his stomach. Not fear exactly, something deeper, the first hairline fracture in certainty. To understand what Klaus Hartmann witnessed that August morning, one must first understand what German military doctrine had become by the summer of 1944. For 5 years, the Wehrmacht had written the textbook on modern armored warfare. They had perfected the blitzkrieg, the lightning war, sweeping across Poland in 27 days, crushing France in 6 weeks, driving deep into the Soviet Union with mechanized precision. Their panzer divisions were the standard by which all others were measured. German engineers had created the most technically sophisticated tanks in the world: the Tiger, the Panther, the King Tiger, machines with armor so thick and guns so powerful they could destroy enemy tanks from distances that rendered return fire meaningless. German officers spoke with casual certainty about armor thickness measured in millimeters, about the superiority of the 88mm gun, about the inherent advantages of their defensive positions. They had studied the Americans carefully. They knew the Sherman tank was inferior, undergunned, underarmored, prone to catching fire. They called them Ronsons after the cigarette lighter because they lit up on the first strike. The Americans, they believed, would fight with the ponderous predictability of industrial thinking, methodical, linear, bound by the textbook rules of supply and logistics. What they did not account for was George S. Patton Jr. Patton's Third Army had become operational in Normandy on August 1, 1944, and within hours it had begun to move with a velocity that seemed to violate the fundamental principles of military science. While other armies measured advances in miles per day, Patton measured his in miles per hour. The textbook said an armored division could sustain an advance of perhaps 12 to 15 miles per day while maintaining cohesion and supply. Patton's columns were covering 50, 60, sometimes 70 miles in a single day. They moved through the Norman hedgerows, burst into open country, and simply kept going. Roads meant for horse carts now thundered with the endless procession of Sherman tanks, half-tracks, tank destroyers, supply trucks, jeeps, and armored cars. A mechanical river that never seemed to stop, never seemed to rest, never seemed to run out of fuel or ammunition or the sheer audacity to keep pushing forward. The German High Command studied their maps with growing bewilderment. Intelligence reports arrived describing American positions that should have been impassable. Units that were supposed to be regrouping near Avranches were reported engaging the enemy near Le Mans, 90 miles to the east. Divisions that should have been securing supply lines were already crossing the Mayenne River. The pins on the situation maps moved faster than the staff officers could reposition them. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, chief of operations for the Wehrmacht, stared at the reports and declared them exaggerated, the product of panicked observers and disorganized frontline units. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, commanding Army Group B, knew better. He had fought the Americans in Normandy. He had seen their fighter bombers swarm like locusts over any column that moved in daylight. But this was something new. This was not the cautious, methodical advance of General Bradley's forces grinding through the hedgerows. This was a cavalry charge conducted with 70-ton machines, and it was tearing the front apart. Patton himself seemed less a 20th century general than some reincarnation of the old cavalry raiders: Nathan Bedford Forrest, J.E.B. Stuart, the Mongol Khans who had conquered continents on horseback. He had studied them all, absorbed their lessons, and translated them into the language of internal combustion engines and armored steel. His command philosophy was deceptively simple: Keep moving, maintain momentum, never give the enemy time to set his defense. Elodes, taujos elodes, he would say, quoting Danton. Audacity, always audacity. While other commanders worried about exposed flanks and vulnerable supply lines, Patton worried about losing speed. His staff officers would present him with the standard calculations, fuel consumption rates, maintenance requirements, the theoretical limits of sustained operations, and Patton would override them all with a single principle. If you can see the enemy, you can kill him. If you're moving faster than he can react, you own the battlefield. The Germans had prepared for a conventional campaign. They had established defensive lines, positioned their remaining panzer divisions at key road junctions, mined the bridges, and fortified the towns. It was competent, professional defensive warfare, the kind that should have channeled the American advance into predictable killing zones where German firepower could extract a terrible price. But Patton simply went around them. When German forces fortified a town, Patton's columns bypassed it, leaving it to be mopped up by follow-on units. When bridges were blown, his engineers had new ones erected in hours, or his tanks simply forded the rivers at unexpected crossing points. When fuel trucks couldn't keep up with the advance, Patton appropriated supplies from other units, borrowed from the British, scavenged from captured German depots, and when all else failed, sent his tanks forward anyway with orders to refuel from the enemy's own stocks. Major Hans von Luck, commanding a panzer reconnaissance battalion, later described the experience of facing Patton's advance as fundamentally disorienting. We would establish a defensive position, prepare fields of fire, sight our anti-tank guns with precision, he recalled. Then word would arrive that American tanks had been spotted 10 kilometers behind us, moving on roads we assumed were still in our rear area. We would withdraw, establish a new line, and discover they were already past that position as well. It was like fighting smoke. They were everywhere and nowhere. And the speed, the unrelenting speed, gave us no time to think, no time to prepare, no time to coordinate a proper defense. The secret to Patton's impassable velocity was not a single innovation, but a complete reimagining of how armored warfare could be conducted. First was his obsession with reconnaissance. While the advance rolled forward, Patton had light tanks and armored cars ranging miles ahead of the main columns, identifying German positions, finding gaps in their lines, locating crossing points over rivers and streams. The moment a gap was found, Patton would exploit it, pouring his armor through before the Germans could respond. Second was his use of parallel routes. Rather than advancing on a single axis that could be blocked, Patton sent his divisions forward on multiple roads simultaneously. If one column encountered resistance, the others kept moving, and the Germans found themselves outflanked without firing a shot. Third was his integration of air power. Patton had trained his command to work seamlessly with the fighter bombers of the Roman 19 Tactical Air Command. German columns attempting to reposition were caught in the open and destroyed from the air. German strong points that might have held for days were reduced to rubble by bombing runs, directed by forward observers traveling with Patton's advance units. But the most revolutionary aspect of Patton's campaign was his approach to logistics. Traditional military thinking held that an army moved only as fast as its supply chain. Patton inverted that relationship. He believed that speed itself was a form of supply, that the faster you moved, the less time the enemy had to destroy resources you might capture. His troops liberated French towns and found German fuel depots intact. They overran Wehrmacht supply dumps filled with ammunition, food, and equipment. They captured railroad yards before the Germans could evacuate the rolling stock. The advance was feeding itself, turning the enemy's own logistical network into an extension of American supply lines. By August 10, 9 days after becoming operational, Patton's Third Army had covered more than 200 miles and liberated dozens of French towns. The city of Le Mans fell on August 8 with barely a fight. The German garrison had evacuated just hours before, expecting at least 2 more days before the Americans arrived. By August 15, Patton's armor had reached Argenton, deep in the German rear, closing the jaws of a trap that threatened to encircle the entire German 7th Army. The Germans, who had planned for a slow, grinding campaign of attrition, found themselves fighting a war of movement they could not win. For Klaus Hartmann and thousands of German soldiers like him, the experience was profoundly psychological. They had believed in the superiority of German equipment and training. They had been taught that the Americans were soft, that they relied on industrial mass production rather than quality, that they lacked the killer instinct of the true warrior. The reality they encountered broke those certainties like glass. Yes, the Sherman tank was inferior to the Panther in armor and firepower, but there were always more Shermans. If one was destroyed, 2 more appeared. If those were knocked out, 5 more came around the flank. The Americans didn't fight like warriors defending a sacred cause. They fought like a machine that could not be stopped, would not be stopped, that simply kept coming with mechanical inevitability. And they were fast, impossibly, incomprehensibly fast. Oberst Rudolf von Gersdorff, Chief of Staff of the German 7th Army, documented the collapse of German defensive plans in a series of increasingly desperate reports. On August 2, he wrote that the American advance was aggressive but containable. By August 5, he noted that American tanks had appeared in locations inconsistent with normal operational tempo. By August 8, his tone had shifted to something approaching panic. Enemy armored columns are advancing at speeds that exceed our ability to reposition forces. Standard defensive calculations no longer apply. The front is fluid to the point of non-existence. By August 12, he wrote simply, "The Americans are moving faster than our communications." By the time orders reach frontline units, the tactical situation has changed beyond recognition. The German soldiers experienced this operational collapse at the most visceral level. Lieutenant Friedrich Berger, commanding a company of Panzer Grenadiers, recorded his experience in a letter that was later captured by Allied intelligence. "We prepared for 3 days to defend the bridge at Alençon," he wrote. "We positioned our pack guns, registered our mortars, established machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire. On the 3rd day, we received orders to withdraw immediately. American tanks were reported 20 kilometers north of our position, in what was supposed to be rear area. We withdrew east, only to encounter American armored cars on the roads we were using for retreat. We scattered into the countryside. Half my company never regrouped. We did not lose them in battle. We lost them in the chaos of trying to stay ahead of an enemy who moved like no army we had ever faced. The symbol that came to haunt German soldiers was not the Sherman tank itself, but the sound it made, the high-pitched whine of the Wright Cyclone engine mixed with the clatter of tracks on pavement. It was a sound that seemed to come from everywhere, echoing through Norman valleys and across French plains, a mechanical shriek that meant the Americans were close, moving fast, and you needed to withdraw now or be cut off and destroyed. Veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had endured the hell of Stalingrad and Kursk, said that fighting the Russians was brutal but comprehensible, a savage struggle between 2 forces willing to pay any price. Fighting Patton's Third Army felt like being hunted by something that never slept, never stopped, never ran out of fuel or ammunition or the will to keep attacking. The transformation this experience worked on the German military consciousness was profound. For 5 years, Wehrmacht soldiers had believed in the inevitability of German victory. They had conquered nations, destroyed armies, occupied vast territories. Even in retreat from Stalingrad and North Africa, they had maintained faith in their ultimate superiority. These were temporary setbacks, strategic withdrawals, necessary adjustments before the final triumph. Facing Patton's advance through France, something deeper cracked. This was not simply losing. This was being overwhelmed by an enemy whose material abundance and operational tempo made resistance feel meaningless. You could destroy 10 American tanks and 20 more would arrive. You could establish a defensive line and wake the next morning to find American troops 10 miles behind you. You could fight with courage and skill and perfect tactical execution, and it made no difference at all. Patton himself understood the psychological dimension of what he was doing. He wrote to his wife Beatrice in mid-August, "The enemy is confused, disorganized, and scared. We must keep him that way. Every hour we give him to rest and reorganize is an hour wasted. Speed is the best armor. Speed is the best reconnaissance. Speed is salvation." To his corps commanders, he was even more direct. "I don't want you to think about defense. I don't want you to worry about your flanks. I want you to think about attack, always attack. The enemy can't hit what he can't catch, and by God, he's not going to catch us." The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Between August 1 and August 31, 1944, Patton's Third Army advanced more than 600 miles, liberated 12,000 square miles of French territory, captured more than 100,000 German prisoners, and destroyed or routed 2 German field armies. The cost in American casualties was remarkably low compared to the grinding attrition of the Normandy hedgerows. Patton's philosophy of speed and maneuver meant his troops spent less time in static battles where casualties accumulated. The Germans, by contrast, suffered catastrophic losses not primarily from combat, but from encirclement and capture. Entire divisions simply disintegrated, their soldiers abandoning equipment and walking west to surrender rather than continue a defense that had become surreal in its futility. The campaign's psychological impact extended beyond the immediate battlefield. In Berlin, the German high command began to grasp the true scale of what the Americans could bring to bear. Intelligence assessments had consistently underestimated American industrial production, believing that reports of tens of thousands of tanks and aircraft must be exaggerated. Facing Patton's seemingly inexhaustible columns, those estimates had to be revised upward and upward again. Generaloberst Heinz Guderian, the brilliant theorist of armored warfare, examined the intelligence reports and understood that Germany was not simply losing a military campaign. Germany was being buried under an avalanche of American material so vast that tactical brilliance and operational skill had become irrelevant. "We are fighting not an army but a machine," he wrote in his diary. "A machine that produces tanks faster than we can destroy them, trains pilots faster than we can shoot them down, and moves with a tempo that makes our doctrine obsolete." For the ordinary German soldier, the experience was even more directly transformative. Many had been told that Americans were cowards who would break under determined assault, that they were gangsters and farmers playing at war. The men who survived encounters with Patton's Third Army told different stories. They spoke of American soldiers who fought with casual competence, who seemed unbothered by the chaos of combat, who acted as though victory was simply an engineering problem to be solved with sufficient application of firepower and gasoline. There was something terrifying in that attitude, not the fanaticism of the SS or the desperate fury of Soviet soldiers defending their homeland, but a kind of relaxed professionalism that suggested the Americans were not fighting for survival. They were doing a job, and they had all the tools necessary to complete it. Hauptmann Erich Hartmann, a Wehrmacht intelligence officer, no relation to Klaus Hartmann the panzer engineer, was captured near Orléans in mid-August. During his interrogation, he made an observation that Allied intelligence officers found striking enough to include in their reports. "You Americans don't fight like you're trying to win," he said. "You fight like you've already won and are just working through the formalities. That is more demoralizing than any propaganda could be." The recurring symbol that linked all these experiences, the tangible representation of American abundance, was the jerry can. It seems almost absurd that a fuel container should become a symbol of military might, but for German soldiers, the ubiquitous 5-gallon gasoline cans represented everything they were fighting against. German forces, by late 1944, were desperately short of fuel. Panzer divisions sat immobilized for lack of gasoline. Wehrmacht units requisitioned civilian vehicles and still couldn't move their supplies. Meanwhile, the Americans seemed to have fuel in infinite supply. Patton's tanks burned gasoline at prodigious rates. A Sherman consumed more than a gallon per mile, yet they never seemed to stop moving. German soldiers capturing abandoned American positions found jerry cans stacked by the hundreds, many still full, simply left behind because the advance was moving too fast to bother with retrieval. It was a kind of calculated wastefulness that German officers, trained in resource management and strategic scarcity, found almost obscene. You could destroy an American tank, and another would arrive fueled and ready. You could cut a supply line, and the Americans would establish a new one. The jerry cans became a bitter joke among Wehrmacht troops. The Americans don't count their fuel in liters. They measure it in rivers. By late August, the liberation of Paris loomed, and Patton chafed at orders to allow French forces the honor of entering the city first. His armies had reached the Seine and were poised to continue east toward Germany itself. The campaign that German planners had expected to last months had been decided in 4 weeks. The Wehrmacht's forces in France had been shattered, not in a single climactic battle, but through a relentless operational tempo that never allowed them to recover, regroup, or establish coherent defensive lines. Klaus Hartmann, the panzer engineer who had watched the impassable dust clouds on that August morning, survived the collapse. He was captured near Chartres on August 18, his unit out of fuel and surrounded. Years later, in a post-war interview, he tried to articulate what it had felt like to watch the American advance. We had been taught that warfare was a science, that there were rules and limits and rational calculations. Patton's army moved like a force of nature, like a flood or a wildfire. You don't defeat a flood with superior tactics. You don't outmaneuver a wildfire. You just try to survive it. He paused, searching for words. The worst part was not losing. It was understanding that we had never had a chance. All our preparations, our technical superiority, our training, none of it mattered against an enemy who could simply overwhelm us with speed and abundance. We were not defeated. We were overrun. The transformation worked on the German military psyche by Patton's advance through France marked the beginning of the end of Wehrmacht confidence. In the east, facing the Red Army, German soldiers could still tell themselves they were fighting Asiatic hordes, that their defeats were due to numbers and brutality rather than genuine superiority. In the west, facing the Americans, no such psychological comfort was available. The Americans were not hordes. They were organized, professional, technologically sophisticated, and they made German resistance look futile. Wehrmacht soldiers in the east still fought with desperate ferocity through the end of the war. In the west, surrender rates climbed steadily. When given the choice between continuing hopeless resistance or walking into American captivity, increasing numbers of German soldiers chose surrender, not out of cowardice, but out of the simple recognition that further fighting achieved nothing but additional death. The strategic implications rippled through the remainder of the war. Hitler's plan to hold France and force the Allies into a costly, grinding campaign had collapsed. The Allies had enlargement on the continent. Liberation of Western Europe was now inevitable, and German forces were in full retreat. The Siegfried Line, the West Wall, Germany's last defensive barrier, had lost its buffer. Patton's armies would slam into it by September, barely 3 months after D-Day. The timetable of the war in Europe had accelerated beyond anyone's predictions, including those of the most optimistic Allied planners. George S. Patton would go on to greater fame, his Third Army driving into Germany itself, crossing the Rhine, liberating concentration camps, and ending the war deep in Czechoslovakia. But it was in France, in those furious 4 weeks of August 1944, that he achieved his masterpiece, a campaign so rapid and comprehensive that it redefined what was possible in armored warfare. Military historians would study it for decades, writing dissertations on his logistics, his command structure, his integration of air and ground forces. But the essential genius was simpler. Patton understood that in modern war, tempo could be as decisive as firepower. An inferior tank moving at 50 miles per hour was worth more than a superior tank moving at 10. An army that kept the enemy off balance through sheer speed could achieve with maneuver what others required in blood. For the German soldiers who faced that advance, the lesson was darker and more personal. They had believed in the superiority of German arms, German training, German will. They had believed that quality would triumph over quantity, that professional soldiers would defeat citizen armies. Patton's drive through France shattered those beliefs not through superior technology. The Sherman remained inferior to German armor, but through the application of industrial abundance at a tempo that made traditional military calculations irrelevant. It was not that the Americans fought better. It was that they fought with such overwhelming material superiority and operational speed that better became meaningless. The epilogue to this story unfolds in countless small moments in the years after the war. German veterans gathering in beer halls and cafes, swapping stories of the campaigns they had survived. Inevitably, someone would mention France in August of '44, and the conversation would shift. The tone would become quieter, more reflective. They would talk about the sound of the American tanks, that distinctive engine whine that meant you needed to move now, right now, or be cut off. They would mention the endless columns of vehicles, the abundance that seemed to mark every German attempt at resistance. And they would acknowledge, with the hard-won wisdom of survivors, that they had not lost to a better army in France. They had lost to a nation that could produce, move, and sustain military power at a scale that transformed war itself into an industrial process. a process where German courage and skill and technical sophistication became as relevant as a craftsman's tools in the age of the assembly line. This is the deeper truth that Patton's impassable speed revealed, that modern warfare had become a contest of systems, not soldiers. The Sherman tank was mechanically reliable and easy to maintain. The American logistics system could deliver fuel, ammunition, and spare parts to the front line with industrial efficiency. The American replacement system could fill casualties and keep units at combat strength. The American industrial base could produce thousands of tanks, while Germany struggled to produce hundreds. Patton did not invent these advantages, but he understood how to exploit them with a ruthlessness and audacity that turned systemic superiority into operational dominance. There is a particular kind of terror in facing an enemy you cannot defeat, not because he is stronger or braver or more skilled, but because he operates at a scale that makes individual courage and skill irrelevant. That was the terror the Wehrmacht experienced in France in August 1944, and it was fitting, perhaps, that this lesson was delivered by George S. Patton, a man who romanticized cavalry charges and read ancient military history, but who understood better than almost anyone else alive how to translate the industrial power of democracy into the brutal poetry of mechanized warfare. The dust clouds Klaus Hartmann saw rising on that August morning were not simply the physical disturbance of tanks and trucks on French roads. They were the visible manifestation of American abundance: oil from Texas, steel from Pittsburgh, engines from Detroit, rubber from plantations in Southeast Asia, all synthesized into a military machine that moved with a velocity that defied every calculation of what should be possible. And behind that machine was an economy so vast, a nation so rich in resources and industrial capacity, that it could sustain that impossible speed month after month, replacing losses, maintaining momentum, advancing until victory became not a question of if but merely when. This is what Patton's campaign through France represented in its deepest sense: the collision between an old world of martial valor and technical expertise and a new world of industrial systems and democratic abundance. The old world fought brilliantly, courageously, skillfully, and it was swept aside in 4 weeks by an enemy that moved too fast to be stopped and possessed resources too vast to be exhausted. The lesson was not lost on those who survived. In the ruins of the Third Reich, as German soldiers came home to destroyed cities and occupied zones, they carried with them the memory of that impossible speed, that unstoppable advance, that mechanical river of olive-green steel that had poured across France like an ocean breaking through a levee. Freedom, it turned out, moved at 50 miles per hour, and it carried its own fuel.